In the summer of 1881, an American Arctic expedition pushed into the far northern reaches of Ellesmere Island, carrying with it the structure of science, military discipline, and national ambition. What was intended as a carefully sustained program of observation soon became a prolonged struggle against isolation, where the landscape itself offered no concession to human planning. At Fort Conger, built near Lady Franklin Bay, the boundary between organized exploration and environmental collapse would gradually narrow under conditions few had ever survived. What follows places you at the edge of that unfolding record, where expedition logs, military reports, and survivor accounts converge but rarely agree. Across frozen coastlines, failed relief attempts, and the silent mathematics of starvation, each stage of the journey reveals how quickly structure dissolves when the systems supporting it stop responding. What remains is not a single version of events, but a sequence of fragments that continue to challenge interpretation long after the ice itself has changed. Orders at the edge of the world. In the closing decades of the 19th century, the Arctic still existed in the public imagination as a white emptiness where maps thinned into guesswork and men vanished into weather. Expeditions entered, that silence carrying flags, instruments, and confidence, yet many returned broken or did not return at all. Nations treated the far north as both laboratory and proving ground, a place where scientific ambition and imperial pride could wear the same face. It was in that atmosphere, when the unknown still seemed conquerable by discipline alone, that the United States prepared a mission whose stated purpose was knowledge, though it would drift towards something darker. The enterprise that became known as the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition was organized in 1881 as part of the First International Polar Year, a coordinated scientific effort involving multiple nations that planned observation stations across the Arctic and subarctic. Meteorology, magnetism, auroral activity, tides, and geography were to be studied simultaneously from scattered outposts, creating a network of data no single country could gather alone. It was an unusually modern idea for its time. Cooperation through science, in one of the least forgiving environments on Earth. For the United States, participation also carried symbolic weight. After the Civil War and years of domestic reconstruction, the nation wanted proof that it belonged among the serious scientific powers of Europe. Responsibility for the American station fell to the War Department, which meant the expedition would be led with military structure rather than by civilian explorers. The man selected to command it was First Lieutenant Adolphus Washington Greely of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Greely was not yet famous, nor was he an old polar veteran. He had served in the Union Army during the Civil War, later joined the Signal Corps, and developed a reputation for efficiency, discipline, and administrative competence. He understood weather observation and telegraphic organization, skills valued in an expedition centered on scientific routine. What he lacked in Arctic experience, officials believed he could make up for with order. Greely was 37 years old when chosen, a careful and ambitious officer whose confidence often appeared stern. Those who knew him described a man of exact habits, impatient with laziness and resistant to disorder. Such qualities could preserve life in the far north, where missed measurements, neglected stores, or loose schedules might become fatal. They could also harden a camp into something brittle. The Arctic had undone men of brilliance before him, and it had little interest in rank. The party assembled under Greely eventually numbered 25 men, including officers, enlisted soldiers, and specialists. Among them was Sergeant David Brainard, who would later become one of the youngest survivors, and eventually a general. Sergeant Frederick Kislingbury, physician doctor Octave Pavey, a French-born doctor and naturalist, and men trained as mechanics, hunters, and observers. They were not a collection of reckless adventurers in the romantic sense. Many were ordinary servicemen assigned to an extraordinary task, selected because they could follow orders, keep records, repair equipment, endure hardship, or shoot straight when food depended on it. Their destination was Lady Franklin Bay on the northeastern coast of Ellesmere Island. Farther north than any permanent American station had yet been placed. There they were to establish a base later known as Fort Conger, conduct scheduled scientific observations, explore surrounding regions, and push northward when possible. The official instructions were clear enough on paper. Supplies would sustain them, annual relief ships would reach them, and if resupply failed after a set period, they were to retreat southward by predetermined routes where caches and rescue could be expected. The plan assumed a chain of dependable decisions stretching across thousands of miles of sea ice and weather. In the Arctic, assumptions often froze first. The material loaded for departure reflected both foresight and illusion. There were prefabricated wooden structures for housing, coal, and fuel, preserved foods, pemmican, alcohol, instruments for astronomy and magnetism, medicine chests, rifles, ammunition, sledging gear, boats, and clothing designed for severe cold. The expedition also carried books, writing materials, and objects meant to sustain morale during the long polar night. Such cargo suggested mastery through preparation. Yet every crate depended on ships surviving ice-choked waters. Every ration depended on accurate planning, and every tool depended on men remaining strong enough to use it. The vessel that carried them north in 1881 was the steam sealer Proteus, accompanied part of the way by supporting ships. Sealing ships were practical choices for polar work, built for hard conditions, but even stout hulls could be crushed when pack ice closed with slow force. As the expedition sailed northward through Greenland waters and Smith Sound, they moved through a region already haunted by earlier ventures. Names on charts Kane Basin, Nares Strait, Robeson Channel were memorials to previous attempts that had measured coasts at great human cost. Each landmark carried a history of frostbite, starvation, scurvy, and men staring too long at horizons that never changed. Public reports at home tended to emphasize heroism and scientific promise. Newspapers described noble exertion, records to be won, and national prestige. What was less visible was the arithmetic of isolation. Once deposited at high latitude, the party would depend on one short navigable season each year for contact. If weather delayed ships, if ice blocked channels, if a captain hesitated, if stores spoiled, if illness spread, there would be no rapid correction. The men might as well have been placed on another planet. Greely himself understood some of this danger, though perhaps not all of it. He insisted on regulations before departure, on clear chains of command, on preserving stores, and on obedience. He knew that winter darkness could damage judgment as surely as cold damaged flesh, but no amount of military precision could fully account for the strange attrition of polar life. Appetite fading, tempers narrowing, small injuries worsening, hope rising and falling with distant sounds that might be ice or rescue. There was also the matter of time. Expeditions often imagined hardship as dramatic moments, storms, accidents, crises. In reality, disasters in the Arctic more often accumulate quietly. A missed ship one summer could become a weakness the next spring. A damaged boat could matter a year later. One unnecessary quarrel could poison months of confinement. Men rarely recognized the decisive moment while it was happening. When the Proteus finally carried Greely's party north to Lady Franklin Bay in August 1881, they were entering one of the most severe inhabited points on Earth, with confidence that systems would protect them. They had orders, charts, discipline, and the authority of a government behind them. They also carried an untested faith that the world beyond the ice still functioned as expected. Ahead stood a lonely wooden outpost, soon to be named Fort Conger, where routine and silence would meet for the first time. Fort Conger in the frozen silence. Ahead of them stood Fort Conger at last, a scatter of timber and stores set against one of the emptiest coasts on Earth. In August 1881, the Proteus reached Lady Franklin Bay and landed Greely's party on the northeastern coast of Ellesmere Island, at a latitude where even summer carried little softness. The bay was ringed by barren ridges, broken stone, and water that could freeze with ice in a matter of hours. Nothing in the landscape suggested comfort or permanence. Yet here, farther north than any American scientific station before it, 25 men began carrying crates ashore with the urgency of those who understood that every hour of open water was temporary. Behind them, the ship would soon depart southward, and with it would go the last easy link to the known world. Once its engines faded into the distance, the sounds that remained were wind, tools striking wood, and the scrape of boots over frozen ground. The landing site itself had been chosen with care by earlier Arctic experience, but no selection could soften the reality of the terrain. The shore rose in uneven layers of rock and frost-shattered earth, a place where vegetation existed only as memory in scattered moss and lichen, pressed flat by centuries of wind. Even the sea ice, which in other regions might have been seasonal, here behaved like a shifting extension of land itself. It fractured without warning and rejoined just as unpredictably. The men understood quickly that their position was not merely remote, but structurally unstable, as if the geography itself refused permanence. Once the boats were unloaded, the work of turning exposed ground into a functioning station began without delay. Materials left years earlier by the British Arctic expedition, under George Nares, were still present, and Greely's men used those supplies alongside their own prefabricated structures to establish the base that would be named Fort Conger. The remnants of earlier exploration, weathered timbers, partial shelters, and stored provisions offered both assistance and a reminder that others had once stood in the same position and still failed to remain. Walls were raised, roofs secured, coal stacked, food arranged, instruments unpacked, and sleeping quarters assigned with military precision. Greely believed confusion could be as dangerous as frost, so stores were inventoried carefully and duties distributed early. The camp's main house became a workshop, mess room, laboratory, barracks, and refuge at once. Outside its walls stretched miles of raw silence. Inside, the men attempted to build a small republic of order. Even small matters were treated seriously, because in such an environment, nothing small remained neutral. Damp clothing had to be dried before it froze into rigidity. Tools were checked against inventory lists to prevent loss in the snow. Lamps required constant trimming, not only for light, but for fuel efficiency, since coal and oil were finite and irreplaceable. Waste removal became a matter of hygiene and survival rather than inconvenience. The Arctic environment did not forgive the accumulation of disorder. A single neglected task could become a structural problem within hours if weather conditions shifted. In this way, discipline was not simply military tradition, but environmental adaptation. Each hour inside the new camp was claimed by schedules, instruments, repairs, and tasks that left little room for idleness. The expedition's purpose was scientific, and Greely enforced that purpose through routine. Meteorological readings were taken at regular intervals day and night, often in brutal temperatures that made even brief exposure painful. Magnetic observations required stillness and patience in conditions that discouraged both. Tidal notes, astronomical measurements, maintenance of equipment, cleaning of quarters, care of clothing, fuel management, hunting preparation, and written reports all formed part of a life measured not by comfort but by discipline. The scientific output of the expedition was not secondary to survival, it was intertwined with it, because structured activity prevented psychological collapse as much as it produced data. Such routines did more than gather information about the Arctic. They stabilized human behavior under conditions designed to erode it. In prolonged isolation, repetition could steady the mind. Men who knew what the next hour required were less likely to drift into the mental weight of distance from home. Diaries from polar expeditions often reveal the same pattern. Structured labor preserved clarity when the environment offered none. Without it, days would blur into indistinguishable stretches of cold and darkness. Boredom itself became a threat, not because it was emotionally unpleasant, but because it dissolved the boundaries that kept survival organized. When the last rim of sunlight slipped below the horizon, the expedition entered a season ruled by darkness. At that latitude, the polar night was not symbolic, but absolute in its practical effect, lasting for months without meaningful daylight. Lamps burned indoors, while temperatures outside plunged to levels that punished exposed skin in moments. Breath froze on beards and clothing, forming layers of ice that had to be broken away before movement could continue. Wood contracted under cold stress, metal stiffened to near immobility, and every short trip beyond the station demanded careful preparation. The boundary between inside and outside became less architectural and more existential. The men read, studied, played games, repaired gear, and continued observations while the world beyond their windows ceased to show itself. Storms could be heard before they were seen, scraping across the land with drifting snow that erased familiar contours. Many explorers feared the cold, but veterans often feared monotony more. Darkness lengthened thought. It stretched perception of time until hours felt uneven, some compressing and others expanding without explanation. Time itself became less a measurement and more a condition experienced differently, depending on workload and weather. Days were counted by duty rosters and meal hours rather than sunrise, and even those markers gradually lost reliability as routine replaced natural cycles entirely. Far beyond the sheltering walls, sledging parties moved across pressure ridges and frozen distances few had ever measured. As light returned in 1882, Greely authorized ambitious journeys to explore surrounding coasts and push northward. Lieutenant James Booth Lockwood, Sergeant David Brainard, and the Greenlander Frederick Christensen undertook one of the most significant of these expeditions. Traveling by sledge over sea ice and hostile terrain, they reached latitude 83 degrees 24 wedges north in May 1882, surpassing previous records for the farthest north attained by human travel at that time. The achievement carried scientific and symbolic importance, expanding geographical knowledge of the Arctic while demonstrating the physical limits of human endurance in polar conditions. Yet the achievement was not defined by distance alone. The journey required repeated crossings of unstable ice formations, where pressure ridges rose like frozen walls, and open leads of water-forced detours that added days of exhaustion. Sledges had to be hauled manually across surfaces that shifted beneath them, often breaking under weight or refreezing unevenly. Sleeping arrangements were dictated by weather rather than schedule, with men resting in tents that offered limited insulation against temperatures capable of freezing exposed skin within minutes. Even the act of writing field notes became an endurance exercise, as ink thickened and fingers lost sensitivity. Other patrols from Fort Conger expanded geographic and geological knowledge of the surrounding region. Coastlines were charted with increasing precision, rock formations were recorded, and meteorological patterns were logged across changing seasons. Musk oxen, hare, and occasional birds provided supplementary food sources that occasionally offset dependence on preserved rations. These hunting successes were irregular but significant, and they reinforced the sense that survival remained possible under proper discipline. Yet every gain was offset by the awareness that such resources were not renewable in a predictable way. The Arctic did not provide abundance, it provided interruption. By every official measure, the mission appeared to be succeeding in the very place meant to test it. Scientific observations were being collected with unusual consistency, and geographic documentation improved understanding of a region still poorly mapped by earlier expeditions. The station remained organized, productive, and comparatively stable through its first winter. Greely later noted the degree of discipline maintained under conditions that would have excused failure in almost any other context. From the perspective of military and scientific institutions far to the south, Fort Conger represented progress achieved through order and endurance. Reports carried that interpretation forward more easily than they carried the physical reality behind it. With another navigable season drawing near, attention slowly shifted from observations to the narrow sea lanes below. The expedition had been designed around annual resupply, and this expectation formed the invisible framework of survival. Ships were intended to bring not only provisions and fuel, but continuity itself, the reassurance that isolation remained temporary rather than absolute. In Arctic operations, morale often rose not when supply arrived, but when it was expected. Anticipation itself functioned as psychological support, anchoring men to a future that still included contact with the outside world. Men watched the waters, discussed dates, and measured the breakup of ice with increasing attention. There was little reason yet for alarm. Delays were common in northern seas, and pack ice could obstruct even determined captains. Confidence depended on repetition. One summer ship, then another. Each season renewing the chain that connected Fort Conger to civilization. Letters already written waited in storage, carrying ordinary news from a place where ordinary life no longer applied. Those letters assumed arrival, not uncertainty. Strength can look most convincing at the moment, dependence is least visible. Fort Conger now stood as a model station in the high Arctic, run by schedules, guarded by discipline, and supported by the visible success of exploration. Yet every coal fire, every ration, every plan still depended on forces outside Greely's command weather in distant straits, decisions made on southern decks, ice moving in channels no one could control. The men had mastered structure within their immediate surroundings. What they had not mastered was the timing of a ship they could not summon. Summer returned to the Arctic, but the horizon remained empty where rescue should have been. The relief ships that never came. Day after day, men climbed the ridges above Fort Conger and searched the water for any sign of movement. Summer in the high Arctic did not last long, and every navigable week carried importance out of proportion to its length. From elevated ground near the station, the sea lanes below could be watched for smoke, masts, or the dark outline of a vessel forcing its way through broken ice. At first, the mood was patient. Ships were delayed in northern waters every year, and no experienced traveller expected perfect punctuality. Men returned from their watches and resumed ordinary duties, speaking of arrival as though it had merely been postponed by the weather. Yet each day without a ship shortened the season in which a ship could still come. What made the waiting tolerable at first was the structure of expectation itself. Arctic expeditions of the period operated on a rhythm that depended on predictable windows of access, where ice would loosen just enough for passage before closing again with seasonal certainty. The men at Fort Conger were not simply waiting for transportation, they were waiting for a system to complete itself. That system included naval coordination, funding schedules, and the assumption that scientific outposts, once established, would not be left without support. Each passing day tested not only patience, but the assumption that such systems functioned reliably at extreme latitudes. According to the plan that had carried them north, summer was supposed to bring ships, letters, and renewed stores. The Lady Franklin Bay expedition had never been intended to survive indefinitely on its original provisions. Annual relief voyages would replenish coal, preserved foods, clothing, medical supplies, and scientific materials while carrying dispatches home. Mail mattered almost as much as food. Letters were proof that time still moved normally somewhere else. They reminded isolated men that families aged, cities changed, and governments remembered promises made. Without that yearly contact, Fort Conger risked becoming less a station than a sealed chamber at the top of the world. Inside that expectation, there was also a technical dependency that often went unnoticed until it failed. Navigation in the high Arctic required coordination between charts, seasonal ice predictions, and the narrow timing of melt conditions that could vary dramatically from year to year. A delay of even a few weeks could transform a navigable passage into an impassable field. The expedition's reliance on resupply therefore rested not on certainty, but on alignment between human planning and environmental behavior that no one could fully control. What appeared on paper as an annual cycle was, in practice, a fragile negotiation with ice. Far to the south, heavy pack ice closed the channels that every rescue attempt was forced to enter. In 1882, the relief vessel Neptune, sent to support Greely's party, encountered severe conditions and was unable to reach Fort Conger. Arctic navigation often depended on narrow opportunities created by wind, tide, and temporary openings between fields of drifting ice. A route passable one week could become a wall the next. Captains who pressed too recklessly might lose ship and crew. Those who turned back preserved lives but abandoned objectives. Such calculations were made hundreds of miles away, invisible to the men waiting in Lady Franklin Bay. They saw only an empty horizon and could not know how close help had failed to come. The absence of communication from these attempts created a second layer of uncertainty. No reliable signal system existed that could confirm failure or delay in real time across such distances. Ships that turned back did so without leaving evidence visible to the stranded expedition. In effect, every failed approach erased itself from the perspective of Fort Conger. What remained was only silence, indistinguishable from neglect. The psychological impact of this absence was gradual but persistent, shaping how each subsequent day of waiting was interpreted. Outwardly, Greely kept the station moving, as though delay were only another ordinary inconvenience. Scientific observations continued on schedule. Instruments were checked, records updated, and hunting parties dispatched when conditions allowed. Greely understood that routine preserved morale and authority. If the commander treated delay as manageable, others might do the same. He also had practical reasons to maintain calm. Panic consumed energy, and energy in the Arctic was a resource as real as coal or flour. Yet beneath official steadiness, calculations had already begun. Every unopened crate now mattered differently because no replacement had arrived. The scientific structure of the expedition also played an unexpected role in sustaining order. Meteorological, magnetic, and astronomical observations required consistent timing regardless of external conditions. Even when morale fluctuated, the instruments demanded attention. This continuity created a kind of institutional rhythm that did not depend on hope. The record would continue whether or not relief arrived. In this sense, science functioned not only as a purpose, but as psychological architecture, forcing attention outward even when anticipation began to collapse inward. By the next thaw, expectation had hardened into necessity. A second summer without relief would be more than disappointing. It would threaten the entire design of the expedition. Provisions had been consumed according to projected timelines. Clothing wears out under harsh use. Fuel stocks declined with each cooked meal, and each lamp lit through the darkness. Hunting could supplement stores, but could not reliably replace them. The men understood this without needing speeches. Conversations about ships became shorter and more frequent. Some watched the coast with open impatience, while others avoided discussing rescue at all, as though silence might protect hope from embarrassment. At this stage, absence itself began to influence behavior. Daily routines were still maintained, but the emotional structure surrounding them had shifted. Tasks were no longer simply duties, they were extensions of an increasingly uncertain timeline. Each completed observation, or repaired object, carried the implicit question of whether it would matter in the absence of return. Even discipline, once a stabilizing force, now carried a different weight, as if order were being maintained for an audience that might never arrive. Somewhere beyond their sight, the relief steamer Proteus was fighting ice that would not yield. In 1883, another major attempt was mounted under Lieutenant Ernest A. Garlington. The Proteus, a vessel already experienced in polar service, pushed north through Smith Sound toward Greely's position. It never reached him. Pressed and damaged by heavy ice, the ship was eventually crushed and lost. Her crew escaped, but much of the cargo intended for Fort Conger was gone with the vessel. Some supplies were landed farther south in hurried caches, though these would prove uncertain lifelines. None of this was known immediately at Fort Conger. Disaster had occurred, but disaster leaves no signal when distance is measured in frozen seas. The loss of the Proteus also reflected a broader limitation of Arctic logistics in this period. Relief operations were not continuous systems, but discrete attempts, each dependent on individual vessels and seasonal opportunities. When one attempt failed, there was no automatic replacement already in motion. The gap between efforts could stretch across entire seasons, leaving expeditions effectively isolated, even while rescue was technically still planned. This structural vulnerability meant that survival often depended less on immediate conditions at the station and more on events occurring far beyond its reach. Inside Fort Conger, no one knew the exact reason another season had passed in silence. There were only possibilities: pack ice, mechanical failure, caution, accident, or bureaucratic neglect. In isolation, ignorance can be harder to endure than bad news. A confirmed loss at least has shape. Uncertainty changes form daily. Men imagined ships trapped just beyond the horizon, then imagined captains turning back, then imagined nothing at all. Even the successful rhythms of the station now sounded different. Pens scratching in logbooks, stove doors closing, boots crossing floorboards, these became noises inside a place no longer connected to events elsewhere. As uncertainty deepened, attention increasingly turned toward internal accounting of survival capacity. Food stores were weighed not only in quantity but in projected duration under reduced rationing scenarios. Fuel consumption was recalculated with greater precision. Clothing repairs were prioritized according to exposure risk. Even scientific activity began to intersect with resource management, as instruments and supplies were evaluated for their utility against their cost in transport effort and maintenance. The expedition was no longer only conducting research, it was measuring its own remaining viability. Numbers on paper now carried more weight than speeches or confidence ever had. Greely and his officers reviewed the remaining stores with increasing seriousness. How much meat remained, how much bread, how much coffee, sugar, alcohol, lamp fuel, ammunition, and medicine, how many men could be supported, and for how long, if nothing changed. Such inventories were common expedition practice, yet now they resembled judgments. A misplaced sack or spoiled barrel was no longer an inconvenience, but a subtraction from survival. Standing orders from General William Hazen had instructed Greely that if relief failed to arrive by the second season, he was to abandon Fort Conger and move southward toward predetermined rescue points and caches. What had once seemed a remote contingency was becoming command. The existence of these orders introduced a new structural tension into the expedition's logic. Fort Conger was both a destination and a temporary phase in a larger system of movement. Remaining in place without resupply risked turning that system into failure. Yet departure meant abandoning a station built through immense effort and scientific investment. The decision was no longer about comfort or preference, but about which form of uncertainty carried less risk. Few injuries cut deeper than the suspicion that they might simply have been left there. Governments announce expeditions in the language of honor and science, but memory can fade once headlines pass. Men at Fort Conger had risked themselves for national prestige and international research, yet now they were confronting the possibility that weather, indecision, and distance had reduced them to an afterthought. Some likely blamed Washington, others the sea, others no one at all. Hardship is easier to bear than uselessness. To suffer for a clear cause can steady a man. To suffer because systems failed is another matter. At last, the orders prepared years earlier could no longer remain folded in Greely's desk. In August 1883, after 2 summers without successful relief, he chose to obey instructions and leave Fort Conger. Boats were readied, sledges arranged, essential records packed, and stores selected under severe limits. Much had to be abandoned: bulky materials, comforts, parts of the station built through 2 years of labour. The rooms that had held arguments, routines, laughter, measurements, and endurance were being reduced to temporary shelter once more. Fort Conger had preserved them, but it could no longer save them. With autumn gathering behind them, the expedition turned south into a wilderness of ice and distance. Retreat south into the white void. Behind them now, Fort Conger faded into the distance as the boats turned toward an uncertain south. The order to abandon the station had not come lightly, yet once issued, it demanded immediate execution. In August 1883, Greely led his men away from the only structured shelter they had known for 2 years, leaving behind buildings, instruments, records, and the fragile accumulation of scientific work that had justified their presence in the high Arctic. The shore receded slowly at first, then more decisively as distance widened, and the last signs of Fort Conger dissolved into the pale geometry of cliffs and snow. What remained ahead was not a route so much as a direction, defined only by the hope that relief depots and rescue waters still existed somewhere beyond the broken ice. No channel stayed open for long in waters ruled by drifting ice. The expedition moved south by a combination of boats and sledges, depending on whether the sea was open or frozen. At times, narrow leads of water allowed brief navigation, and the men rowed with urgency through passages that could close without warning. At other moments, the same route became impassable, forcing them onto unstable flows where boats had to be hauled across rough, shifting surfaces. The Arctic did not offer resistance in a single form. It alternated between liquid and solid barriers, each one requiring a different kind of exhaustion. What had been planned as a retreat quickly became a continuous negotiation with a landscape that refused to remain consistent for even a single day. Whenever the sea hardened around them, the men bent their shoulders to ropes and dragged the boats forward by hand. The vessels themselves were not large by naval standards, yet on ice they became impossible burdens, scraping across ridges and catching in fractures that cut into wood and muscle alike. Sledges were improvised where possible, but much of the hauling was done directly by manpower. Boots slipping on glassy surfaces, hands exposed to rope burns and frostbite. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Each advance required rest that felt shorter than the effort required to achieve it. The illusion of travel northward months earlier now inverted itself into a slow compression of effort and reward, where movement no longer guaranteed arrival anywhere meaningful. Piece by piece, possessions that had once seemed essential were cast aside to lighten the loads. Scientific instruments, spare clothing, excess provisions, and personal items were abandoned as necessity narrowed the definition of survival. Greely's orders emphasized discipline even in loss, insisting that records and vital supplies be preserved as long as possible. Yet the arithmetic of weight versus endurance grew unforgiving. Every discarded object represented both progress and regret. The expedition had begun with carefully balanced logistics. It now operated under the logic of subtraction. What could not be carried became irrelevant, and what remained had to justify the strength required to move it. Before long, wind and freezing spray began punishing them more reliably than hunger had. As September advanced, the environment itself shifted toward early winter conditions. Storms rolled across the water with increasing frequency, reducing visibility and making navigation uncertain even when routes appeared open. Clothing stiffened with ice after every exposure, and equipment required constant maintenance to remain usable. Men who had once worked in structured scientific routine now found their days consumed by survival tasks that left little room for observation or record keeping. The Arctic did not announce change, it imposed it gradually until the previous way of living simply became impossible. Among the men, fatigue announced itself first in silence, then in temper, then in slowed movement. Exhaustion accumulated not through single events but through repetition, each day adding a layer of strain that sleep could not fully remove. Conversations shortened. Orders were obeyed more slowly, not from defiance, but from reduced capacity. Small disagreements became more noticeable in cramped conditions, though discipline, under Greeley, remained largely intact. The presence of military structure prevented immediate collapse into disorder, but it could not prevent the physical erosion of strength. Men who had once carried scientific precision in their work now measured effort by what could be accomplished without complete collapse afterward. Every landmark promised more than it delivered as they searched southward for expected stores and relief. The expedition's route depended on cached supplies left at intervals during earlier planning, yet Arctic geography often distorted expectations. Ice shifted positions, coastlines were less distinct than maps suggested, and markers became difficult to identify under snow and seasonal change. At times, locations believed to contain provisions yielded little or nothing usable. Each disappointment reduced not only supplies, but confidence in the reliability of the plan itself. The further they travelled, the more the landscape seemed to remove evidence that organised rescue had ever been possible. Soon, even the boats, their last instruments of escape, became burdens trapped in new ice. Freeze-up accelerated earlier than practical travel could accommodate, encasing water routes and forcing the expedition fully onto land and ice surfaces. The vessels that had carried them south were no longer transportation, but weight to be managed, dragged, and protected as conditions worsened. Without open water, mobility collapsed into dragging motion alone, and every attempt at forward progress became dependent on weather windows that grew narrower with each passing day. The sea that had once offered passage now functioned as a barrier, sealing them in place. At the edge of Pym Island, the expedition finally reached ground, tied to their remaining hopes. Cape Sabine and its surrounding coastline were known from earlier expeditions, and there was expectation, however, uncertain that supply caches might exist nearby. The terrain, however, offered no reassurance. It was exposed, barren, and increasingly locked in early winter conditions. Ice formed along shorelines while winds funneled through open stretches of water and rock. The men made contact with land not as arrival but as interruption, a temporary halt in movement rather than an end to travel. What mattered now was not exploration, but whether survival could be extended long enough for rescue that had already failed to appear once. There, with winter near, they began shaping a camp from whatever wood, canvas, and strength remained. Boats were inverted and broken down to form a shelter. Materials were repurposed into walls, roofing, and windbreaks. The encampment that formed would later be associated with Cape Sabine and Pym Island, a place not designed for habitation, but forced into that role by necessity. Every action taken was governed by conservation of heat, food, and energy. The men were no longer moving through the Arctic in any meaningful sense. They had entered a condition of waiting inside a structure assembled from remnants of movement. On that desolate shore, the living settled in beside the place where death would soon keep count. Camp Clay and the first deaths. At Cape Sabine, the expedition stepped onto shore that offered no protection from the wind or the open sea beyond it. The landing in late 1883 placed Greely's party in one of the most exposed coastal environments on the northeastern edge of Ellesmere Island, where land offered little relief from the same forces that governed the sea. Ice pressed against the shoreline in shifting formations, and the terrain itself provided no natural shelter from storms that could arrive without warning. This was not a destination in any meaningful sense, but the last available point where survival could still be attempted. The men had reached it believing that supply caches might exist nearby, placed earlier under the assumption that retreat routes would be supported. What they found instead was a coastline that looked unchanged by human intention, indifferent to expectation, and already entering the long descent into Arctic winter. The geography of Cape Sabine removed any illusion that arrival meant stability. Unlike Fort Conger, which at least offered structure through prior occupation and partial shelter, this shoreline provided no architectural memory of human presence that could be reused. Everything had to be improvised under immediate pressure, with the weather already shaping every decision. The coastal wind moved uninterrupted across the water and struck the land with full force, carrying ice crystals that cut exposed skin and reduced visibility even in daylight. The men were forced to think not in terms of building comfort, but in terms of reducing exposure by degrees that could mean the difference between survival and collapse. Inside the makeshift shelters, broken boats and torn canvas were rearranged into walls that barely held against the cold. The structure that became known as Camp Clay was not constructed so much as improvised from necessity, using the hulls of abandoned boats, fragments of wood, and salvaged fabric stretched and weighted against the wind. It was a settlement defined by absence rather than design, where every improvement required dismantling something else. Heat was minimal and inconsistent, maintained through carefully rationed fuel that could not be wasted. The interior spaces were cramped, damp, and continuously affected by frost forming on interior surfaces. Men slept in proximity not for comfort, but because shared body heat became one of the few remaining resources available. The act of transforming wreckage into shelter carried its own silent logic. Every structural decision reflected not planning but subtraction what could be removed from elsewhere without causing immediate failure. Wooden beams taken from one section weakened another. Canvas repurposed for insulation reduced the availability of wind protection. Even the arrangement of sleeping spaces became a calculation of proximity versus airflow. The camp existed as a constant negotiation between exposure and depletion, where improvement in one area often produced vulnerability in another. During the first days ashore, the absence of expected supply caches became an immediate and silent problem. The expedition had been instructed to rely on depots established along retreat routes, yet as searches began, it became clear that either the caches were insufficient, inaccessible, or never reached in usable condition. Each return from search carried the same result: uncertainty replacing expectation. The psychological weight of this absence grew gradually, not through sudden realization, but through repeated confirmation that nothing awaited them beyond what they carried. In Arctic conditions, where survival depends on external support systems, the failure of those systems is not immediately dramatic. It is instead incremental, revealed through the slow subtraction of possibilities. Search parties operated under conditions that made verification difficult, even when resources existed nearby. Snow cover could conceal depots entirely, and shifting ice could alter terrain enough to make previously recorded locations unrecognizable. The reliability of earlier navigation marks diminished rapidly under seasonal change. What had been established as logistical certainty in planning documents became, on the ground, an uncertain landscape where memory and geography no longer aligned. Each unsuccessful search reinforced the same conclusion without explaining. As provisions dwindled further, strict rationing began to replace every earlier assumption about survival. Food stores were measured with increasing precision, and distribution became a central concern of daily life. Greeley maintained discipline, understanding that uncontrolled consumption would accelerate collapse, yet the mathematics of survival grew increasingly unforgiving. Men who had once operated under structured schedules of exploration and science now oriented their days around caloric preservation. Hunger did not appear suddenly. It expanded gradually into every decision, influencing movement, conversation, and even rest. The Arctic environment outside the shelter mirrored this internal narrowing, as daylight shortened and temperatures dropped, reinforcing the sense that reduction had become the governing principle of existence. Rationing did not function only as administration. It became a visible system of survival ethics. Every portion distributed carried implicit weight, representing not just nourishment, but time extended or lost. Decisions about allocation required constant adjustment as inventories changed. The absence of predictable replenishment meant that every calculation was provisional. Men began to understand survival not as a fixed duration, but as an uncertain curve shaped by consumption rates that could not be stabilized indefinitely. Under conditions of permanent frost, the first physical signs of scurvy appeared in swelling limbs and weakened strength. The lack of fresh food sources, particularly vitamin C, began to affect the men in ways consistent with documented Arctic expeditions of the period. Symptoms included fatigue, joint pain, gum deterioration, and reduced mobility, all of which compounded the already severe strain of exposure and starvation. Tasks that had once been routine, such as hauling supplies or maintaining shelter, required increasing effort. The body's inability to recover efficiently created a feedback loop of decline. In an environment where physical strength was directly tied to survival, illness did not merely reduce capability. It reshaped the hierarchy of who could still function at all. Medical understanding of scurvy at the time offered limited practical relief under expedition conditions. While its causes were known, effective prevention depended on access to fresh provisions that were no longer reliably available. Preservation methods used for long voyages could delay the onset, but not prevent it indefinitely under prolonged deprivation. At Camp Clay, the progression of symptoms became visible across multiple individuals, reinforcing the sense that environmental conditions were now operating directly through the human body itself. Within the confined camp, the first death marked the point where endurance ceased to be evenly shared. The loss of a member under such conditions did not occur as a singular shock, but as a confirmation of what was already unfolding. Death in Arctic expeditions of this era often followed predictable patterns under extreme deprivation, exposure, malnutrition, and disease converging until recovery was no longer possible. At Camp Clay, each loss altered the balance of labour and survival pressure for those remaining. The camp did not stop or reorganize in any formal sense. It simply continued under a reduced capacity, with each remaining man absorbing additional strain. The presence of mortality changed the psychological atmosphere more than the physical structure, turning survival into something that was no longer abstract. After the first death, time within the camp began to feel structurally different. Days did not change in length, but their internal weight shifted. Tasks that previously belonged to routine now carried an association with loss, as each action continued in the absence of someone who had previously performed it. Memory inside the confined environment became unavoidable because there was no external context to dilute it. The camp contained its entire history within a shrinking present. Before winter fully closed in, the burial of the dead became increasingly difficult in the frozen ground. The Arctic soil at Cape Sabine, already locked by early permafrost conditions, resisted any attempt at traditional burial. Bodies had to be managed within the limitations of ice and stone, often requiring placement in shallow depressions or temporary preservation until conditions allowed further action. This practical difficulty reinforced the permanence of death in a way that was difficult to ignore. The environment itself prevented closure. Nothing in the landscape allowed for quick resolution or symbolic separation. The dead remained part of the same physical space as the living, only repositioned within it. Among those still able to work, movement slowed as exhaustion reshaped even simple daily tasks. The rhythm of camp life became increasingly reduced to essential actions, maintaining shelter integrity, managing heat sources, and distributing limited food. Conversations shortened, not from emotional withdrawal alone, but from the physical effort required to sustain speech in cold, dry air. Even small exertions carried consequences that lasted longer than before. The distinction between working and resting blurred, as neither state provided full recovery. In such conditions, efficiency was no longer an abstract ideal, but a matter of conserving what remained of human capacity. After the first signs of illness spread, the camp began to feel smaller, despite nothing physically changing. Space within the shelters remained constant, but perception of confinement intensified as conditions worsened. Men spent more time inside due to weather, fatigue, and necessity, which created a sense of compression that had little to do with actual dimensions. The Arctic winter outside reinforced this feeling by offering no visual variation, only continuous whiteness and wind-driven ice. Psychological adaptation became as important as physical endurance, though neither could fully compensate for the cumulative strain. The camp existed now as a closed system, increasingly cut off not only from relief, but from any sense of external progression. By the time the sea froze solid, the boundary between survival and waiting for death had nearly disappeared. The freezing of surrounding waters eliminated the last visible sign of seasonal change that might have indicated the possibility of movement or rescue. Ice extended outward from the shore until it merged with the horizon, creating a continuous surface that removed the distinction between land and sea. Within Camp Clay, this environmental closure reinforced the understanding that mobility was no longer possible. What remained was endurance under conditions that no longer offered directional choice. The expedition, once defined by movement and scientific purpose, had become defined by endurance without destination. When the last ration was measured, even the silence inside Camp Clay began to feel like hunger. Hunger without end at Camp Clay. Inside the camp, what remained of the stores no longer matched what the men believed had been set aside. At Cape Sabine, the structure known as Camp Clay had already begun functioning less as shelter and more as containment. Its walls formed from overturned boats and salvaged fragments that could not resist the Arctic wind for long. The inventory Greely's men had carried south was never abundant, but it was expected to be sufficient under normal Arctic retreat conditions. Those assumptions now failed in quiet ways. Barrels that contained less than expected, provisions that spoiled faster than anticipated, and items that disappeared into use simply to maintain warmth. The camp did not collapse in a single moment. It weakened through accounting errors that could no longer be corrected by replacement. Well before the depth of winter could be measured in full, every portion of food had already begun to shrink into calculation. The act of eating ceased to be routine and became a structured assessment of survival probability. Rations were divided into increasingly precise fractions, each man receiving only what could be justified against projected endurance. Greely maintained military discipline in distribution, understanding that uncontrolled consumption would shorten survival time dramatically, yet discipline itself could not expand the available food. The Arctic environment outside reinforced this restriction, offering no supplementary resources beyond occasional hunting attempts that yielded limited success. Even when seals or birds were obtained, they represented temporary relief rather than structural change. Hunger was no longer episodic. It became continuous, measured not in moments, but in persistence. Reduced inventory began turning ordinary objects into items re-evaluated for their potential to sustain life. What had once been considered waste or equipment now entered the logic of consumption. Leather from boots, scraps of preserved material, and remnants of earlier supplies were all reconsidered under conditions of extreme deprivation. The distinction between useful and unusable weakened as survival narrowed its criteria. Scientific instruments, personal belongings, and non-essential materials lost their separation from food-related calculations. In such conditions, value was no longer determined by function or purpose, but by caloric possibility. The camp's internal world began to reflect a single hierarchy in which everything was ranked against the question of whether it could be converted into energy. Simple movement, once unconsidered, now required a level of effort that had to be deliberately justified. Men who had previously hauled sledges across Arctic distances during exploration now struggled with basic internal tasks inside the camp. Standing, walking, and lifting required preparation rather than impulse. Muscle strength declined steadily under the combined effects of starvation and scurvy, reducing coordination and endurance simultaneously. The environment offered no recovery cycle. Cold persisted even inside the shelter, and warmth was never sustained long enough to restore physical equilibrium. Each action carried a visible cost, and that cost accumulated over time until even minor exertion had measurable consequences in fatigue and weakness. Food distribution nights grew quieter, not from discipline alone, but from what speech seemed to cost. The act of receiving rations became one of the few remaining structured events in the camp. Yet even this process carried psychological weight. Conversation diminished during these moments, replaced by observation and internal calculation. Men began to understand their survival in relation to others, not through competition, but through shared depletion. The atmosphere surrounding distribution reflected an unspoken awareness that each portion removed from storage reduced the camp's collective future. Silence in this context was not emotional withdrawal, but conservation of energy. Speaking required effort that could no longer be justified without necessity. Those still capable of working carried out tasks that demanded more energy than they could realistically recover. Maintenance of shelter, collection of fuel where possible, and basic camp organization continued despite diminishing physical capacity. The Arctic environment offered no reprieve from these responsibilities. Wind-driven snow infiltrated shelters, equipment froze in place, and materials degraded under constant exposure. Every task required overcoming environmental resistance that increased in proportion to weakening strength. Work did not cease entirely because cessation would have immediate consequences, yet continuation produced a different kind of risk, gradual exhaustion leading toward functional collapse. Standard provisions disappeared entirely, leaving no uncertainty about whether more supplies would arrive. The transition from rationing to absence was not marked by announcement, but by exhaustion of remaining stores. At this stage, survival shifted from planned endurance to immediate improvisation. The absence of food was no longer theoretical or future-oriented. It was present and absolute. Earlier expectations of resupply or relief had already failed in previous chapters, but here that failure became physically embodied in empty containers and unresponsive storage areas. The camp's structure remained intact, yet its internal system of sustenance had effectively ceased. Every remaining object in the camp began to be examined through its possible connection to survival. This process extended beyond food into broader material assessment. Tools, clothing components, and structural materials were all reconsidered under conditions of necessity. The boundary between survival and environment blurred further as the camp became a closed system in which internal resources were continuously re-evaluated. Even non-edible items entered the psychological framework of hunger through association with potential conversion. The mind, under sustained deprivation, began to reinterpret physical surroundings according to metabolic need rather than original purpose. Routine itself started to fracture, not through chaos, but through the gradual loss of physical capacity. Daily structure remained in form, but weakened in execution. Scheduled tasks were delayed or completed with reduced efficiency. Scientific observation, once a defining element of the expedition's identity, became secondary to survival maintenance. Greely's command structure persisted, but authority could not restore physical strength. The Arctic environment imposed a uniform constraint across rank and role, reducing all distinctions to variations in endurance. What remained of order functioned more as a habit than a system, sustained by inertia rather than capability. Time in the camp stopped reflecting expectation and became measured only through endurance already spent. The passage of days no longer carried anticipation of change. Instead, it registered as an accumulation of depletion. Weather cycles continued externally, but internally, the camp experienced continuity rather than progression. The distinction between one day and the next weakened as routines lost their anchoring significance. In such conditions, survival became detached from future projection. The men existed in a present defined entirely by diminishing reserves, without reliable reference to recovery or relief. In the deeper phase of starvation, physical symptoms extended beyond fatigue into systemic failure consistent with scurvy and malnutrition. Joints stiffened, gums deteriorated, and movement became increasingly restricted. These conditions compounded existing weakness, making even short tasks difficult to sustain. The Arctic environment intensified these effects by preventing recovery through warmth or rest. Medical understanding of the period recognized scurvy as a nutritional deficiency, yet treatment options were limited by available resources. Without fresh provisions, physiological decline continued regardless of effort or discipline. As conditions worsened, psychological focus narrowed to immediate perception of hunger. Cognitive patterns shifted toward repetitive awareness of food absent. This was not abstract suffering, but continuous bodily feedback, reinforced by environment and exertion. Even scientific reasoning, once central to the expedition's identity, became difficult to sustain under caloric deficit. Concentration weakened, memory became less reliable, and decision-making required greater effort. The camp's intellectual structure gradually receded beneath physiological demand. The Arctic night deepened around Camp Clay, and external conditions reinforced internal decline. Darkness, wind, and frozen sea created an environment without variation, removing visual cues that might otherwise mark progression or change. In such a setting, survival was reduced to maintenance of minimal function under continuous stress. The men remained alive, but life itself had been stripped of most of its former structures, leaving only the persistence of hunger as a constant reference point. When nothing left in the camp could restore what the body had lost, even discipline began to feel like something borrowed. Theft, punishment, and the shot in the dark. What remained in the stores no longer matched the pace at which it was being consumed. At Camp Clay near Cape Sabine, the expedition had already entered its most unstable phase, where survival was no longer defined by exploration or retreat, but by the strict management of diminishing provisions. The structures built from wrecked boats and salvaged materials now functioned less as shelter and more as containment for a group of men whose survival depended entirely on what had been carried south months earlier. Every barrel, tin, and scrap of preserved food had already been accounted for repeatedly. Yet even under strict oversight, the numbers no longer aligned with expectation. The Arctic environment remained unchanged outside, but inside the camp, the sense of depletion had begun to alter behavior itself. Weeks of ration checks began revealing inconsistencies too persistent to dismiss as error. Greely maintained a structured system of distribution, relying on military discipline and recorded inventories to prevent disorder from accelerating collapse. Each issue of food was measured, logged, and assigned according to necessity rather than preference. Yet as the winter deepened, small discrepancies accumulated into a pattern that could no longer be attributed to miscalculation or spoilage alone. In an environment where every portion of food represented survival time measured in days, even minor loss carried disproportionate weight. The act of accounting itself became a form of tension, with each review of supplies reinforcing the awareness that the camp was moving steadily toward depletion, with no external replenishment. No formal accusation was spoken at first, yet the pattern of loss became increasingly difficult to ignore. Within the confined structure of camp life, awareness of scarcity created a psychological environment where observation replaced trust. Men who had once relied on shared discipline now began to notice small deviations in behavior, movement, and timing. The absence of clear communication about the missing provisions did not prevent understanding, it only delayed it. In such conditions, suspicion does not require confirmation to influence behavior. It spreads gradually, shaped by repetition and reinforced by necessity, until it becomes part of the operational environment itself. Ration distributions now carried an added layer of observation that had not existed earlier in the winter. The act of receiving food, once purely administrative, became a moment of silent scrutiny. Each portion issued was weighed not only in physical measure, but in its implication for the group's collective survival. Greely's officers maintained order during these distributions, but the psychological atmosphere had shifted. Hunger no longer existed solely as a physical sensation. It had become a shared condition that influenced perception and interpretation. Even routine actions, such as handing out provisions or returning to shelter, carried an undercurrent of evaluation, as if every movement might reveal further imbalance within the system. Greely's attention gradually shifted from external rescue conditions toward internal control of the camp. Earlier phases of the expedition had been defined by navigation, retreat, and waiting for relief that never arrived. Now, leadership is centered on maintaining order under conditions where no external correction is possible. The failure of relief expeditions had already removed the expectation of immediate rescue, and the camp's remaining structure depended entirely on internal discipline. In this environment, command authority became more than an administrative function. It became the only mechanism preventing complete collapse into uncontrolled survival behavior. Every decision carried dual weight, sustaining physical endurance while preserving cohesion among men under extreme deprivation. Shortages that once seemed structural began taking on a distinctly personal dimension within the group. The disappearance of food was no longer viewed solely as an environmental or logistical issue. Instead, it was interpreted through the lens of individual responsibility, because, in a closed system, without external interference, every loss required internal explanation. The Arctic conditions outside remained constant, but within the camp, human behavior became the primary variable under examination. This shift altered the nature of relationships between the men. Shared hardship no longer guarantees a uniform interpretation of events. Instead, survival pressure introduced uneven perceptions of accountability and necessity. Provision counts eventually narrowed suspicion toward a repeated and measurable pattern of disappearance. The documentation maintained by Greely and his officers provided a framework for identifying irregularities, even under extreme conditions. Although record-keeping itself became increasingly difficult as physical strength declined, enough structure remained to identify inconsistencies across distribution cycles. These inconsistencies were not dramatic in isolation, but their repetition created a statistical pattern that could not be ignored. In a situation where survival depended on precise allocation, even small deviations accumulated into significant consequences over time. The camp's internal system of survival thus became increasingly sensitive to any disruption in expected distribution. Disciplinary measures, once procedural, started to take on greater weight as survival pressure increased. Military structure had always been present within the expedition, but under normal conditions, it functioned primarily as organizational support. In the Arctic winter at Camp Clay, it became central to survival itself. Greely's authority, reinforced by his standing orders and military background, required maintaining order even when morale and physical strength were collapsing. The enforcement of discipline was no longer a matter of efficiency or hierarchy. It was a mechanism intended to preserve the remaining structure of the group. However, the intensity of deprivation meant that every disciplinary decision carried consequences that extended far beyond its immediate context. Private Charles Henry came under scrutiny after multiple irregularities were linked to ration losses. Historical accounts of the Greely expedition identify Henry as having been repeatedly associated with the disappearance of food stores during the most severe phase of starvation. In a setting where food was the primary determinant of survival, repeated loss could not be treated as incidental. The identification of responsibility, whether through observation or accumulation of evidence, placed Henry at the center of a disciplinary crisis that combined survival necessity with military law. Within the confined environment of Camp Clay, such identification carried implications that extended beyond individual conduct, affecting the stability of authority itself. Military authority within the camp reached a point where discipline and survival could no longer be separated. Greely's decision-making during this period reflected the intersection of command responsibility and extreme environmental pressure. The enforcement of order under conditions of starvation created a situation in which traditional disciplinary boundaries were reinterpreted through survival logic. The punishment decision was not isolated from the conditions that produced it. It was shaped entirely by them. In the absence of external judicial systems, the camp operated under an internal command structure where consequences for actions affecting collective survival were determined within the expedition itself. The execution order that followed was carried out under Arctic conditions that reduced all procedural elements to their most minimal form. The act occurred outside the main shelter, in an environment defined by darkness, cold, and limited visibility. No unnecessary elements accompanied the enforcement of the order. It was conducted under military authority, consistent with Greely's command responsibility, and recorded within the context of expedition discipline. The surrounding environment absorbed sound and movement quickly, leaving no lingering external trace beyond what the men themselves experienced. In conditions where survival had already narrowed human experience to essential functions, the act itself became part of the camp's continuing struggle to maintain structure. Beyond the reach of the lantern light, the silence that followed settled into the camp like something permanent. Flesh of the dead. The final phase of starvation left no remaining distinction between rationing and the complete absence of food. At Camp Clay near Cape Sabine, the Greely expedition had already passed beyond structured deprivation into a condition where survival no longer depended on careful distribution, but on the total exhaustion of all stored provisions. The camp, formed from overturned boats and fragments of earlier retreat, had become a sealed environment in which every object had already been evaluated for usefulness and then re-evaluated again under worsening necessity. What remained was not an evolving system of survival, but a closed cycle of diminishing capacity, where each day reduced both physical strength and the possibility of recovery. The Arctic winter outside maintained its constant pressure, indifferent to the internal collapse unfolding within the shelter. Historical accounts describe a steady breakdown in physical coordination as Arctic conditions intensified at Cape Sabine. Movement within the camp became increasingly restricted by weakness, scurvy, and prolonged malnutrition, all of which compounded the effects of extreme cold. The men of the expedition, already reduced by earlier deaths and exhaustion, operated under conditions that no longer allowed normal physical recovery. Tasks that had once been routine during earlier phases of the expedition required sustained effort that exceeded available energy. The environment did not change in character, but its effect became more pronounced as the body's ability to resist it diminished. Arctic cold, wind exposure, and continuous darkness formed a stable external pressure against which internal resilience steadily failed. Complete depletion of provisions reduced daily activity to minimal movements required for immediate survival. Food stores, once carefully managed through rationing under Greely's command, had reached absolute exhaustion. What remained of the camp's structure could no longer support traditional distribution, because there was nothing left to distribute. In earlier stages of the expedition, scarcity had been managed through discipline and calculation. Here, scarcity became total. Every action within the camp was now measured against physical capacity rather than logistical planning. The distinction between organized survival and biological persistence began to disappear. The men were no longer managing resources, they were managing the absence of resources. By the remaining weeks at Cape Sabine, death had become frequent enough to alter the structure of daily camp life. Mortality among the expedition members increased under the combined effects of starvation, scurvy, and exposure. Each death reduced the number of men capable of maintaining essential functions, including shelter upkeep, fire maintenance, and basic movement of supplies. The camp structure did not formally collapse, but its operational capacity narrowed significantly with each loss. Survival was no longer distributed evenly across the group. It became concentrated in those still physically capable of movement, while others gradually ceased to contribute to the camp's limited functioning. The presence of death was no longer an isolated event, but part of the camp's continuous condition. Increasing mortality placed additional strain on those still capable of performing essential tasks inside the camp. As the number of able-bodied men decreased, remaining responsibilities were redistributed without regard to physical limitation. This created a compounding effect where those still active were required to compensate for both environmental pressure and the loss of manpower. The Arctic environment amplified this imbalance by increasing the difficulty of even basic tasks. Fuel collection, shelter maintenance, and minimal logistical coordination became increasingly difficult to sustain. The structure of discipline remained in place under Greely's command, but its practical effectiveness diminished as physical capacity eroded across the group. Recorded observations note how Arctic cold delayed natural processes that would normally resolve the presence of the dead. The environment at Cape Sabine, characterized by sustained sub-freezing temperatures, altered the typical progression of decomposition. Bodies did not follow expected biological timelines due to persistent cold conditions, which slowed decay and complicated handling. This created additional logistical strain within the camp, where physical exhaustion already limited capacity for any non-essential activity. The presence of the dead within such conditions reinforced the permanence of loss in a way that could not be quickly resolved through natural processes. The environment itself prevented closure, extending the visibility of mortality across time rather than allowing it to fade. As the winter isolation reached its final stage, attention among those still alive became increasingly restricted to immediate physical necessity. Cognitive focus narrowed under the combined effects of starvation and continuous environmental stress. Decision-making was increasingly oriented towards short-term survival rather than long-term planning. Earlier phases of the expedition had involved navigation, construction, and structured retreat. By this stage, mental energy was directed almost entirely towards sustaining minimal bodily function. The Arctic winter provided no variation in external conditions, reinforcing this internal narrowing by removing visual and environmental change. The result was a psychological environment defined by continuity of deprivation rather than progression. Later reports compiled after the expedition's rescue contain references to actions taken under conditions of extreme deprivation. These accounts, based on testimony and subsequent investigation, describe survival behaviors that occurred after all conventional food sources had been exhausted. Within historical documentation of Arctic expeditions of the 19th century, such references are not unique to this case, but in the context of the Greely expedition, they remain among the most contested and heavily examined aspects of the survival period at Cape Sabine. The reports do not present uniform detail, but they consistently indicate that survival reached a stage where normal dietary boundaries could no longer be maintained under prevailing conditions of starvation. Accounts from members of the party vary in detail, but consistently describe the erosion of established behavioral boundaries. The breakdown of physical resources coincided with a breakdown in previously maintained social and ethical structures. Military discipline under Greely remained formally in effect, but its practical application became increasingly constrained by physical exhaustion and environmental pressure. In conditions where survival itself was no longer assured, behavior was shaped less by institutional structure and more by immediate necessity. The Arctic environment functioned as a limiting framework in which all human systems, disciplinary, logistical, and physiological, operated under continuous degradation. The absence of any remaining provisions created a condition in which survival depended entirely on what could still be physically sustained. At this stage of the expedition, food scarcity had reached its absolute limit. No external support remained available, and internal reserves had been fully exhausted. The camp existed in a state where continuation depended not on recovery, but on endurance, under conditions that no longer supported normal biological maintenance. Every remaining action within the camp was influenced by the awareness that no further supplies existed, and that survival was now a function of time measured against physical depletion rather than replenishment. In the deeper phase of Arctic isolation, the boundary between environment and body became increasingly indistinct. Cold, hunger, and fatigue operated not as separate pressures, but as overlapping conditions affecting every aspect of daily existence. The men of the expedition, already reduced in number, existed within a closed system where external relief had ceased to be a factor in immediate survival planning. The Arctic environment, unchanged in its physical properties, became more decisive in its effect as human capacity declined. What remained of the expedition was no longer defined by exploration or retreat, but by the persistence of life under conditions that offered no meaningful path forward. With the first signs of external approach appearing beyond the frozen horizon, the condition of the camp had already passed beyond recovery. Rescue among the corpses. From the deck of the approaching relief vessel, the coastline of Cape Sabine first emerged as a fractured outline of rock and drifting ice. In June 1884, the Arctic sea route near northern Ellesmere Island had finally opened enough to allow a coordinated relief expedition to approach the region where Lieutenant Adolphus Greely and his party had been stranded for months. The ships moved cautiously through broken ice, following a coastline that offered no clear indication of human presence at first glance. The terrain appeared unchanged from the descriptions recorded in earlier exploration reports: barren, wind-scoured, and locked in a seasonal transition that still carried the remnants of winter. There was no signal, no structured marker, and no visible movement, suggesting an organized encampment remained intact. Through shifting Arctic light, the scattered remains of shelters gradually resolved into recognizable forms along the shore. As the vessels drew closer, what had initially appeared as irregular snow formations began to reveal themselves as collapsed structures made from overturned boats and salvaged expedition materials. These were the remnants of Camp Clay, the improvised settlement constructed during the desperate winter at Cape Sabine. Snow still clung heavily to the wreckage, obscuring much of its original shape. The Arctic light, low and diffuse, even in early summer conditions, cast long, muted shadows across the shoreline, emphasizing the uneven geometry of destruction rather than any sign of order or recovery. At the moment land came fully into view, there was no visible sign of coordinated movement or organized life. The rescuing crew observed no immediate response to their approach, no signaling, and no indication that a structured group remained capable of normal activity. The silence of the shoreline was not temporary, but sustained, broken only by wind and ice shifting against rock. In earlier Arctic expeditions, contact with stranded parties typically involved signaling fires, movement, or visible distress activity. Here, there was none of that expected response. The absence itself became the first indicator that conditions on shore had surpassed normal survival threshold. Upon reaching the shoreline, the rescuers found structures collapsed under accumulated snow and months of neglect. The encampment had been shaped by extreme improvisation during the winter of 1883-1884, and by the time of rescue, it bore the full weight of seasonal abandonment and environmental pressure. Boat hulls that had once served as shelter roofs were partially buried or overturned. Canvas and wooden fragments were frozen into rigid forms by prolonged sub-zero conditions. The layout of the camp was still partially traceable, but only in outline, as if the structure of human intention had been slowly erased by weather over time. There was no evidence of recent reconstruction or sustained activity. The first inspection of the camp revealed unmistakable evidence of prolonged starvation and environmental exposure. Supplies that had once supported survival were no longer present in usable form. Remaining materials appeared exhausted, consumed, or rendered unusable by time and cold. The physical environment within the settlement reflected extended deprivation, weakened structural integrity, limited fuel remnants, and signs that the camp had operated under continuous scarcity. Nothing within the immediate surroundings suggested recovery had been possible at any stage during the winter months. The Arctic environment had effectively preserved the final condition of the camp exactly as it had been left. Moving deeper through the settlement, the presence of the dead confirmed the full severity of the winter that had passed. Bodies were found in various locations around the encampment, positioned where final moments had occurred during the prolonged period of starvation and exposure. Historical accounts of the Greely expedition later confirmed that multiple members had died during the winter at Cape Sabine, reducing the original party significantly before rescue could arrive. The Arctic cold had slowed natural decomposition, leaving remains in conditions that emphasized the duration of isolation rather than the passage of time. The environment itself functioned as a preservative force, locking evidence of mortality into the landscape. During initial contact with the survivors, their condition demanded immediate medical intervention due to extreme physical deterioration. Only a small number of men were found alive when the rescue crews reached the camp, consistent with later official records of the expedition's survival rate. These men exhibited severe effects of prolonged starvation and scurvy, including extreme emaciation, weakness, and limited mobility. Their ability to respond to external presence was reduced, requiring assistance during evacuation procedures. Medical attention aboard the rescue vessels became the immediate priority, as the physical state of the survivors indicated prolonged deprivation under Arctic conditions without adequate nutrition or recovery. Among the frozen remnants of the encampment, scattered equipment and abandoned supplies were documented in careful detail. Items associated with earlier phases of the expedition's scientific instruments, personal effects, and remaining structural materials were found dispersed throughout the site. The condition of these objects reflected extended exposure to extreme cold and repeated handling under conditions of necessity. Documentation by the rescue expedition recorded the state of the camp as part of a broader effort to understand the circumstances that had led to such extreme loss of life. Each item recovered contributed to a reconstructed understanding of the winter's progression at Cape Sabine. Official records from the expedition confirmed that only a small number of men were still alive after the months of isolation. Of the original 25 members of Greely's party, only 6 survived to be rescued in June 1884. Lieutenant Adolphus Greely himself was among the survivors, along with a small group of enlisted men. The mortality rate reflected the combined effects of starvation, scurvy, and exposure under conditions where external relief had failed to arrive in time. These figures, later verified through military records, placed the Greely expedition among the most severe cases of survival attrition in Arctic exploration history. The numerical reduction of the party underscored the intensity of environmental and physiological pressure experienced during the winter at Cape Sabine. Before departure from the Arctic coast, the rescue crew secured both survivors and all recoverable records of the expedition's condition. The evacuation process required careful coordination due to the weakened physical state of the remaining men and the logistical challenges of navigating through Arctic ice conditions. Documentation, logs, and remaining scientific materials were collected alongside the survivors to preserve a record of the expedition's experience. The rescue vessels then withdrew from Cape Sabine, leaving behind the remains of Camp Clay and the surrounding settlement. The shoreline gradually receded into the distance as the ships moved away, carrying both living survivors and the recorded evidence of what had occurred during the winter of isolation. Far behind the retreating ships, Cape Sabine remained fixed in silence, unchanged by the fact that anyone had ever arrived. Scandal, inquiry, and the shadow that remained. News of the expedition's survival reached the United States through fragmented reports carried by returning vessels and early telegraph dispatches. The return of Lieutenant Adolphus Greely and the few men who had survived the winter at Cape Sabine marked the end of one of the most severe Arctic expeditions undertaken under American command in the 19th century. Yet the moment of arrival did not resolve the story. Instead, it shifted its center. What had been an event defined by ice, starvation, and isolation now entered a different environment entirely, one shaped by institutions, public opinion, and written record. The Arctic conditions that had governed every decision on the ground were replaced by a new kind of pressure, where interpretation began to matter as much as survival had once done. Formal military review procedures were initiated shortly after Greely and his surviving men arrived back under naval custody. The United States Army, responsible for the expedition's organization and command structure, began assembling official accounts of the journey from Fort Conger through the retreat and final encampment at Cape Sabine. These proceedings relied on written logs, survivor testimony, and reports compiled by officers involved in Arctic operations. Greely, as commanding officer, was required to provide detailed accounts of decisions made under extreme conditions. The structure of inquiry reflected standard military procedure of the period, focusing on discipline, logistics, and command responsibility rather than emotional interpretation. However, the extraordinary nature of the expedition meant that ordinary categories of evaluation were strained by the conditions described. Newspaper accounts circulating in major cities rapidly transformed the Arctic return into a subject of national attention and debate. Press coverage in the United States emphasized both the scale of survival and the magnitude of loss, noting that only a small fraction of the original expedition had returned alive. The public received accounts filtered through official statements, survivor interviews, and early reports from military sources. These narratives often emphasized endurance and hardship, presenting the expedition as a test of human resilience under extreme Arctic conditions. At the same time, the stark details of starvation, exposure, and mortality ensured that the story extended beyond simple celebration of survival. Public reactions soon expanded beyond relief, shifting towards scrutiny of what had occurred during the months of isolation at Cape Sabine. As more details emerged, attention increasingly focused on leadership decisions, relief failures, and the conditions under which survival had been maintained. The American public, already familiar with Arctic exploration through earlier 19th century expeditions, began to situate the Greely expedition within a broader pattern of polar risk and institutional responsibility. Questions arose not only about what the men endured, but about how such conditions had been allowed to develop without timely intervention. The expedition became a focal point for broader discussion about the limits of exploration and the responsibilities of government-backed scientific missions. Conflicting testimonies presented to investigators revealed inconsistencies in how survival conditions were later described. Accounts from surviving members varied in emphasis and detail, particularly regarding the final months at Cape Sabine. Military investigators compared these testimonies against expedition logs and external reports in an attempt to reconstruct a coherent timeline. However, the extreme conditions under which the events occurred made precise reconstruction difficult. Memory, exhaustion, and the passage of time influenced how individual experiences were recorded and later recalled. As a result, the official record of the expedition contained areas of ambiguity that could not be fully resolved through documentation alone. Official correspondence examined by military authorities raised questions about the timing and effectiveness of earlier relief attempts. The failure of relief ships to reach the expedition during critical periods became a central point of inquiry. Historical records indicate that multiple rescue efforts were attempted, but environmental conditions and logistical challenges delayed or prevented successful contact. The investigation did not treat these failures as isolated incidents, but as part of a broader assessment of Arctic operational planning. Questions of navigation, timing, and resource allocation were examined in relation to the extreme unpredictability of polar ice conditions. The correspondence reflected an institutional effort to determine whether the outcome had been unavoidable or preventable within the constraints of the era. Congressional hearings concerning Arctic operations began to frame the expedition as an example of logistical and administrative failure. While Greely himself was often regarded with respect for maintaining discipline under extreme conditions, the broader structure supporting the expedition came under scrutiny. Lawmakers examined funding decisions, planning assumptions, and coordination between the military and naval branches responsible for Arctic exploration support. The expedition became a case study in the risks associated with extended polar operations without guaranteed supply lines or reliable rescue windows. These discussions extended beyond the Greely expedition itself, influencing how future Arctic missions were organized and supported. Military evaluations of Greely's command placed emphasis on discipline maintained under conditions of starvation and environmental collapse. Despite the extreme mortality rate, official assessments recognized the difficulty of maintaining order under conditions where normal logistical systems had completely failed. Greely's leadership was evaluated within the framework of military duty under extraordinary circumstances, where standard expectations of command were tested by environmental forces beyond control. The awarding of the Medal of Honor to Greely reflected this institutional interpretation, recognizing endurance, leadership, and adherence to duty despite catastrophic conditions. At the same time, the complexity of the expedition ensured that no single interpretation fully defined its outcome. Historical interpretations that developed in subsequent years diverged sharply between accounts emphasizing heroism and those emphasizing systemic breakdown. Some narratives framed the expedition as a testament to endurance in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, highlighting survival against overwhelming odds. Others focused on planning failures, delayed rescue efforts, and the severe human cost of Arctic ambition during the period of 19th century exploration. These differing perspectives did not resolve into a single consensus, but instead coexisted within historical scholarship, reflecting the layered nature of the expedition itself. The Greely expedition became not only a historical event, but a continuing subject of interpretation shaped by changing standards of judgment. Later, scholarly assessments continued to position the expedition as one of the most complex and contested survival events in Arctic exploration history. Its significance extended beyond the immediate circumstances of survival and loss, influencing broader discussions about exploration ethics, logistical responsibility, and the limits of human endurance in extreme environments. The expedition's records, testimonies, and recovered documentation remained central to Arctic historical studies, frequently revisited in light of evolving historical methodology. Each reassessment added a further dimension to an event that had already been fully documented, yet never fully resolved in meaning. The story of what happened beyond the ice never fully settled into history, remaining suspended between record and uncertainty.